The Secret of the Turbine Hall, 1938 to 1939. The story does not begin in the cockpit, but in the hushed, chalk-dusted halls of German academia and the competitive world of engine design. By 1938, the theory of jet propulsion was not a secret. Britain's Frank Whittle and Italy's Secondo Campini were wrestling with their own designs. But in Germany, two parallel and initially competing efforts were gathering unstoppable momentum. In Göttingen, the brilliant young physicist Hans von Ohain, bankrolled by the industrialist Ernst Heinkel, had already successfully bench-tested a hydrogen-fueled turbojet engine, the Hees 1, in September 1937. His approach was pragmatic, innovative, and driven by a passion for flight. Simultaneously, at the Junkers Engine Company in Magdeburg and later Dessau, a team under the formidable Anselm Franz was working on a government-sponsored project. Franz was a different breed of engineer, less a visionary, more a master of industrial application. He understood that a successful jet engine needed not just to work, but to be manufacturable in large numbers using non-strategic materials. This divergence was critical. While von Ohain pushed the boundaries of what was possible, Franz focused on what was practical. He envisioned an axial flow compressor, a more complex but ultimately more powerful and streamlined design than Whittle's or von Ohain's centrifugal flow engines. By late 1938, the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, RLM Reich Air Ministry, issued a development contract for a new airframe designed specifically to house this nascent technology. The contract, under project number P.1065, was awarded to the Messerschmitt AG in Augsburg, helmed by the notoriously difficult but undeniably brilliant Willy Messerschmitt. The archival evidence from Messerschmitt's own project office reveals a design that was breathtakingly futuristic. Penned by project head Voldemar Voigt, the early drawings from April 1939 showed a sleek, low-wing monoplane with the two engines nestled in pods underneath the wings. This placement was a stroke of genius. It allowed for easy engine access, maintenance, and the ability to swap out different engine models as they evolved, a crucial advantage over designs that buried the engines within the wing root or fuselage. To ensure the jet exhaust cleared the tail, a conventional tail was used, but the triangular main gear design was novel, a decision that would later haunt the project. The aircraft we would come to know as the Me-262 was born on paper, a predator waiting for its heart. A Body Without a Heart, April 1941 to July 1942. While Willy Messerschmitt's team perfected the P.1065 airframe, the engine development programs were plagued by catastrophic failures. The promise of jet power was tantalizingly close, yet technologically distant. The primary challenge lay in metallurgy. Inside a jet engine, the turbine blades spin at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute while being blasted by superheated gases exceeding 800 degrees Celsius. The alloys available in the late 1930s and early 1940s simply couldn't withstand these hellish conditions. They would stretch, warp, and disintegrate. Archival test logs from BMW and Junkers, the two firms now leading the engine race, are a litany of violent failures. BMW's 003 engine prototypes had a nasty habit of shedding their compressor blades, which would then shred the rest of the engine in a catastrophic explosion. Anselm Franz's Junkers Jumo 004 was more promising, but it too suffered from turbine blade failures and vibration issues. The average operational life of these early prototypes was measured not in hundreds of hours, but in a dozen, sometimes less. The Third Reich, flush with its blitzkrieg victories in Poland and France, saw no urgency. The war, Hitler and Göring believed, would be won with the existing generation of piston-engined fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf Fw-190. In a now infamous exchange, Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, reportedly scoffed at the jet project, convinced the war would be over long before such fantasies were needed. This official ambivalence starved the jet programs of priority funding and, more importantly, access to scarce strategic materials like nickel, cobalt, and molybdenum, which were essential for creating heat-resistant alloys. Consequently, the first Me-262 prototype, the V-1, V for Versuchsflieger, or experimental aircraft, was ready for flight long before its jet engines were. On April 18, 1941, the sleek, empty airframe took to the skies over Augsburg, but it was a bizarre sight. A conventional Junkers Jumo 210 piston engine was bolted to its nose, a propeller slicing the air where a cannon port would one day be. The sleek jet-age body was being dragged through the air by old technology, a perfect metaphor for the project's status, a body without a heart, a future held hostage by the present. The first true flight, July 18, 1942. The breakthrough came from Anselm Franz's team at Junkers. Through painstaking engineering, they developed new turbine blades. Instead of being solid, they were hollow and air-cooled, a revolutionary innovation that significantly increased their durability. They were crafted from a less-than-ideal steel alloy named tinitor, a compromise forced by the chronic shortage of chromium, but it was just good enough. By the summer of 1942, two of the new Junkers Jumo 004A pre-production engines were deemed reliable enough for a flight test. They were bulky, weighing nearly twice as much as a comparable piston engine, and produced a modest 1,850 pounds of thrust each, but they worked. On July 18, 1942, at the Lyceum airfield near Gunzburg, the Me 262 V3 prototype sat shimmering on the runway. The two Jumo 004A engines were slung under its wings. As a precaution, the backup piston engine was still mounted in the nose, a sign of the pilot's deep-seated mistrust of the new gas turbines. In the cockpit sat Messerschmitt's unflappable chief test pilot, Flugkapitän Fritz Wendel. The pre-flight checks were alien. There was no propeller pitch to set, no mixture to lane. Wendel described in his post-flight debriefing, a document preserved in Allied intelligence archives, the eerie sound of the turbines spooling up, a rising, unearthly shriek that replaced the familiar roar of a piston engine. Following procedure, he powered up the nose-mounted piston engine first, its propeller biting into the air. He then advanced the throttles for the jets. The acceleration was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The aircraft surged forward with a powerful, relentless push. Wendel had been instructed to be gentle with the landing gear due to concerns about its tail-dragger configuration. At 180 km per hour, 112 miles per hour, he gently lifted the tail, but the jet exhaust, now blasting directly onto the runway, blanked the elevator's airflow, rendering it useless. The plane refused to rotate. Thinking fast, Wendel tapped the brakes. This instinctive, brilliant move caused the aircraft to pitch forward, lifting the tail high enough for the elevators to bite. The Me 262 V3 leaped into the air. Wendel immediately shut down the nose engine. For the first time in history, a recognizable jet fighter was flying purely on the power of its turbines. It was as if angels were pushing, Wendel later recalled. The age of propeller-driven fighters had just become history, whether the world knew it or not. Galland's Epiphany and Hitler's Folly, May 22, 1943 and November 26, 1943. Despite Wendel's successful flight, the project languished. The RLM bureaucracy, combined with skepticism from senior Luftwaffe officials, kept the Me 262 in a low-priority development limbo. It took a living legend of the Luftwaffe to change that. On May 22, 1943, General Adolf Galland, the charismatic and battle-hardened General der Jagdflieger, general of the fighter arm, visited the Messerschmitt test center at Lechfeld. Galland was a pilot's pilot, with over 100 aerial victories, and he was deeply worried. He saw firsthand how the ever-increasing swarms of American B-17s and B-24s, escorted by long-range P-47s and P-51s, were winning the air war. The Luftwaffe was losing pilots and planes at an unsustainable rate. He needed a game-changer. He was offered a test flight in the Me 262 V4 prototype. What happened next is detailed in his own famous memoirs. The flight was a revelation. The sheer speed, the lack of propeller torque and vibration, the incredible rate of climb, it was a new dimension of flying. Upon landing, his report to Göring was ecstatic and now legendary. It felt as if an angel were pushing me. This is not a step forward, it is a leap. It will give us an unimaginable advantage. Galland became the jet's most powerful advocate. He fought passionately in the halls of power, arguing that the Me 262 must be rushed into production as a pure interceptor. Its speed would allow it to slash through bomber formations, immune to the defensive fire of both the bombers and their escorts. Mass production was finally approved in the summer of 1943. But a catastrophic obstacle emerged from the one place it could not be challenged, the Führer's Wolfschanz headquarters. On November 26, 1943, during a demonstration of the aircraft at Insterburg in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler, accompanied by Willy Messerschmitt and Hermann Göring, inspected the Me-262. After Messerschmitt assured him it could carry bombs, Hitler turned to him and asked the fateful question, "Can this aircraft carry a bomb load?" Messerschmitt, perhaps eager to please or simply stating a technical possibility, replied, "Ja, mein Führer." Theoretically, it can carry a 500 kilograms bomb, perhaps even two 250 kilograms bombs. Hitler's eyes lit up. He saw not a bomber killer, but a Blitz bomber, a superfast, unstoppable bomber to repel the anticipated Allied invasion of France. He declared, "This is the Blitz bomber I have been demanding for years. No one thought of this. I hereby order that the Me-262 be developed as a fighter bomber, and as nothing else." Galland and the senior Luftwaffe staff were aghast. Their savior, the pure interceptor, was to be bastardized into a tactical bomber, a role for which it was ill-suited. Hitler's command, born of strategic ignorance and obsession, had just dealt the German air defense a potentially fatal blow. The Battle of the Blueprint, Interceptor versus Blitz Bomber, December 1943, summer 1944. Hitler's Blitz Bomber decree threw the entire Me-262 program into chaos. The directive was technically absurd and tactically suicidal. A deep analysis of the Me-262's design specifications reveals why. The aircraft's phenomenal speed was its primary defensive and offensive asset. Strapping bombs onto external pylons created immense aerodynamic drag, slashing its top speed by over 150 km per hour, 93 miles per hour, and crippling its acceleration and maneuverability. It turned a thoroughbred into a plow horse. Furthermore, its groundbreaking automatic leading-edge slats, which gave it excellent low-speed handling for a swept-wing jet, were compromised. Most critically, the Junkers Jumo 004B engines, now being mass-produced with even more compromises on strategic materials, were notoriously fragile. They were prone to flaming out or exploding if the throttle was handled too aggressively, a common necessity in a dogfight, but less so in a bombing run. However, the bombing mission profile required diving, which could easily overspeed the turbines, and the subsequent pull-up put immense strain on the airframe. The plane simply wasn't designed for it. The archives of the RLM are filled with the subsequent, almost surreal bureaucratic battle. Adolf Galland, along with Field Marshal Erhard Milch, the Inspector General of the Luftwaffe, engaged in a campaign of subterfuge and passive resistance against the Führer's order. Secretly, they authorized the continued production of the pure fighter variant, the Schwalbe, while officially prioritizing the fighter-bomber Sturmvogel. Minutes from high-level meetings show them desperately trying to explain the technical realities to Hitler, only to be rebuffed. Hitler, fixated on a retaliatory weapon to strike the invasion beaches, could not be swayed. He saw the general's resistance as defeatism, even treason. In one heated exchange in May 1944, when informed that the fighter version was still being produced, Hitler flew into a rage, screaming that he would have Göring executed and threatening courts-martial for anyone who disobeyed his order. This internal conflict caused months of fatal delays. As the factories began to tool up for mass production, precious time and resources were wasted designing and testing bomb racks and rudimentary bomb sites, while the Allied bomber streams grew larger and more confident. The skies over Germany were burning, and its most advanced defensive weapon was being shackled by the fantasy of its own leader. While engineers battled physics, the generals battled a dictator, and the clock was ticking down to D-Day. The tricycle imperative and the production nightmare, early 1944. While the political battle over the Blitz bomber raged in the halls of the Reich Chancellery, another critical struggle was unfolding on the factory floors and test airfields. The Me-262's initial taildragger landing gear configuration, a relic of propeller-era design, was proving to be a catastrophic flaw. As test pilot Fritz Wendel had discovered on the first flight, the jet exhaust striking the ground blanked the tail control surfaces, making takeoff a perilous affair. Worse, the tail-down attitude on the ground directed the hot, high-velocity jet blast downwards, melting asphalt runways and kicking up rocks and debris that were inevitably sucked into the low-slung, fragile Jumo engines. The term for this was foreign object damage, FOD, and it was the bane of the early jet age. Test reports from the Recklen-Erprobungsstelle, the Luftwaffe's central military aviation test facility, from late 1943 are filled with accounts of engine failures caused by ingested debris. The landing was equally hazardous, with the aircraft's high speed and the poor view over the long nose leading to frequent accidents. The solution was a tricycle landing gear, with a nose wheel instead of a tail wheel. This kept the fuselage level, aimed the jet blast safely behind the aircraft, and dramatically improved the pilot's forward visibility. The fifth prototype, the V5, was fitted with a fixed tricycle gear and flew in June 1943, proving the concept's superiority. The subsequent V6 prototype tested a fully retractable nosewheel design. However, the conversion of the production line was another source of maddening delay. It required significant re-engineering of the nose section and fuselage structure. This technical hurdle coincided with the intensifying Allied bombing campaign. Codenamed Big Week in February 1944, a series of massive Allied bomber raids specifically targeted German aircraft production centers. The Messerschmitt factories in Augsburg and Regensburg were pounded into rubble. In a desperate measure, production was dispersed into a fragmented network of smaller, hidden facilities, some in caves or deep within forests, the infamous Waldfabriken, forest factories. This dispersion, while protecting production from bombing, created a logistical nightmare. Fuselages were built in one forest, wings in another, and engines in a third, with final assembly taking place on camouflaged stretches of the Autobahn. Quality control plummeted, spare parts became scarce, and production targets, already delayed by redesigns and political indecision, slipped further and further behind schedule. First Blood, Commando Thierfelder, April-July 1944. By the spring of 1944, a handful of production Me-262A1A Schwalbe fighters were trickling off the chaotic assembly lines, despite Hitler's order. Field Marshal Milch, in a final act of defiance before being stripped of his power, had sanctioned the creation of a special test and development unit, Reprobungskommando 262, to develop tactics for the new jet. Based at Lechfeld Airfield in Bavaria, the unit was initially commanded by Hauptmann Werner Thierfelder. The pilots, hand-picked aces from the front lines, found themselves in a new and dangerous world. The transition from a piston engine FW-190 to the Me-262 was profound. The sheer speed was intoxicating, but the temperamental Jumo 004B engines demanded a delicate touch. Advancing the throttle too quickly would flood the combustion chamber with fuel, causing a flameout or, worse, a turbine fire. The engines had a painfully slow throttle response, meaning a pilot couldn't just firewall it to get out of trouble. On April 19, 1944, Reprobungskommando 262 flew its first operational-style sorties. According to the unit's war diary, Kriegstagebuch, their mission was to intercept high-altitude Allied photo-reconnaissance aircraft. For weeks, they had frustratingly little success, hampered by engine problems and the sheer difficulty of intercepting fast, high-flying targets. The first confirmed kill by a Me-262 in combat is often credited to Lieutenant Alfred Schreiber on July 26, 1944. Flying over the Alps, he intercepted a British de Havilland Mosquito from No. 540 Squadron RAF, a notoriously fast, unarmed reconnaissance plane that had been virtually untouchable by German piston fighters. Schreiber, closing at a speed the Mosquito pilot could not have comprehended, raked the wooden aircraft with the Me-262's four powerful 108 Malawian Quachas 30mm cannons. The Mosquito disintegrated. The kill was a symbolic victory. It proved that, when it worked, the jet was unstoppable. But the triumph was short-lived. Just 2 days prior, the unit's commander, Thierfelder, had been killed when his Me-262 crashed during a dogfight with P-51 Mustangs, a stark reminder of the jet's vulnerability at low speed and the inexperience of its pilots against seasoned Allied fighter jocks. Stormbirds over Normandy, August 1944. As the Allies consolidated their Normandy beachhead following the D-Day landings, Hitler's demand for a Blitz bomber was finally met, with disastrous results. The first unit to be equipped with the Me-262A2A Sturmvogel fighter bomber was Kampfgeschwader 51 Edelweiss, KG-51. Rushed into service, the unit was tasked with stemming the Allied tide. The pilots, mostly experienced bomber crews with no fighter training, were given cursory conversions to the jet. The results, as detailed in KG-51's operational logs, were pathetic. The rudimentary bomb sight, a simple Greif sight adapted from a dive bomber, was completely inadequate for the speeds the Me-262 operated at. Pilots were supposed to enter a shallow dive from 4,000 meters, release the bomb at 1,000 meters, and pray. Accuracy was abysmal. Bombs were scattered across the French countryside, rarely hitting their intended targets of bridges, supply dumps, or troop concentrations. Worse, the Sturmvogels were hopelessly vulnerable. Dragged down by their bomb loads, their speed advantage was negated. They became prey for the swarms of Allied fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, that owned the skies over France. The Allied pilots, initially terrified of the jets, quickly learned their weaknesses. A Me-262 was a sitting duck during its long takeoff run, its slow landing approach, or when encumbered by bombs. Allied pilots began to rat-catch over German airfields, loitering at high altitude and diving on the jets as they took off or landed. In August 1944, KG-51 mounted a series of attacks against the Allied breakout at Avranches. The official Luftwaffe communiques lauded them as great successes, but the unit's internal reports, now stored in captured German archives, paint a picture of utter failure. They lost over a dozen jets in a few weeks, mostly to accidents and Allied fighters, in exchange for negligible damage to the enemy. The Blitz bomber concept was a strategic dead end, a costly diversion that had consumed precious months, lives, and machines for nothing. The Bomber-Destroyer, Armament and Tactics, Autumn 1944. By September 1944, the failure of the Sturmvogel was so undeniable that Hitler finally, grudgingly, relented and authorized priority production of the Me-262A1A Schwalbe interceptor. Adolf Galland immediately set about forming the first true jet fighter wing, Jägergeschwader 7 Nowotny, JG-7, commanded by the 258 Victory Ace Major Walter Nowotny. The unit's mission was simple and brutal: destroy the American daylight bomber formations. The Me-262 standard armament was a battery of 4 Rheinmetall Borsig 108 Malawian Quachas 30mm cannons in the nose. These were devastating weapons. An analysis of their technical specifications shows they fired a low-velocity, but massive, high-explosive shell. A single hit could obliterate a fighter, and just 2 or 3 were enough to tear the wing off a B-17 Flying Fortress. However, their slow rate of fire and looping, rainbow-like trajectory made them difficult to aim at long range. The jet pilots had to develop entirely new tactics. The speed difference was the biggest challenge. A B-17 formation flew at around 320 km per hour, 200 miles per hour, while the Me-262 attacked at over 800 km per hour, 500 miles per hour. The closing speed was so immense that a pilot had less than 2 seconds of firing time in a standard rear attack before overshooting the target. JG-7 pilots, therefore, adopted a different approach. They would dive from high altitude, pass through the formation, and then pull up in a wide, sweeping turn to attack from the side or rear quarter. This roller coaster tactic maximized their energy advantage and gave them a slightly better firing angle, but it still required immense skill and timing. To increase their lethality, engineers developed the R-4M Worken, Hurricane, air-to-air rocket. 12 of these unguided, spin-stabilized rockets were carried on wooden racks under each wing. A pilot would fire a salvo from 1,000 meters out, aiming for the center of a bomber box. A single rocket hit was often enough to bring down a 4-engine bomber. This allowed the jets to engage from outside the effective range of the bomber's .50 caliber defensive machine guns, a crucial tactical advantage that promised to finally turn the tide in the defense of the Reich. Nowotny's command, a short, blazing life, November 8, 1944. The story of Major Walter Nowotny and his command is a dramatic and tragic episode that encapsulates the promise and peril of the Me-262. Nowotny was an Austrian prodigy, a Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds recipient, and a national hero. He was given command of the experimental jet unit, now named Commando Nowotny, and tasked with proving the jet's operational viability from two hastily prepared airfields at Akmar and Giuseppe. From the outset, the command was a pressure cooker. It operated under the constant scrutiny of the Luftwaffe High Command and the constant threat of Allied fighter sweeps. The unit's operational record from October and early November 1944 is a mix of spectacular success and crushing failure. On good days, Nowotny's pilots would slash through bomber formations, downing several B-17s for no losses. On bad days, engine failures, landing accidents, and attacks by lurking Allied fighters would decimate their strength before they even reached the bombers. The climax came on November 8, 1944. A massive formation of over 1,200 American bombers, escorted by hundreds of P-51s, was heading for targets in western Germany. High-ranking Luftwaffe generals, including Adolf Galland, were at Akmar airfield to witness the operation. The weather was poor, with low cloud cover. Nowotny himself took off to lead the attack. Over the radio, the generals on the ground listened to the drama unfold. Nowotny reported engaging the bombers and claimed 2 kills. Then, the transmission became garbled. He reported one of his engines had failed. His last, chilling words were partially obscured by static but sounded like burning. He was then seen diving vertically out of the clouds, his Me-226 trailing smoke, before crashing into the ground. The exact cause of his death remains debated by historians. Was he shot down by P-51s known to be in the area? Did his damaged engine explode? Did he lose control in the clouds? What is certain is that the Luftwaffe had lost its premier jet ace. Nowotny's death, after his unit had claimed 22 Allied aircraft for the loss of 26 of its own jets, many to non-combat causes, highlighted the brutal reality. The Me-262 was a magnificent weapon, but it was also a fragile, unforgiving machine being flown in an increasingly hopeless war. The era of the lone ace was over, the age of industrial attrition had truly begun. Jagdverband 44, the Squadron of Aces, February-May 1945. By early 1945, the German air defense was in its death throes. The Luftwaffe had been shattered, its pilot training programs were producing novices with barely 100 hours of flight time, and fuel was scarcer than hope. In this atmosphere of impending doom, Adolf Galland, who had been sacked by Göring from his post as general of the fighter arm for his constant and vocal criticism, was given one last, extraordinary command. He was authorized to form his own elite Me-262 unit, a squadron composed of the highest decorated, most experienced aces left in the Luftwaffe. This unit was Jagdverband 44, JV-44. Its emblem was a charging knight, and its unofficial motto, reflecting the grim reality, was "The inmates are running the asylum." Based near Munich at Riem Airfield, JV-44 became a legend. Galland's personal logbook, a priceless archival document, shows the caliber of men he recruited, aces like Johannes Mackie Steinhoff, 176 victories, Gerhard Barkhorn, 301 victories, Walter Krapinski, 197 victories, and Heinz Pritzel-Bahr, who would end the war with 16 victories in the Me-262, making him the highest-scoring jet ace in history. These were not young hotheads, they were seasoned, weary veterans who saw the Me-262 not as a wonder weapon to win the war, but as the only tool that gave them a fighting chance to survive it. Their expertise was invaluable. They understood aerial combat in a way no one else did and quickly mastered the jet's unique characteristics. They perfected the hit-and-run tactics, using the jet's superior speed and climb rate to engage and disengage at will. Analysis of their combat reports shows a clear pattern: high-speed, diving attacks on bomber formations, often using the R-4M rockets to break up the tight defensive combat boxes from a distance, followed by cannon passes on the stragglers. JV-44 was a tiny spark of professional brilliance in a sea of mediocrity, a last gathering of the Knights of the Air. Their very existence was an indictment of the Luftwaffe's earlier mismanagement of the jet program. Here, finally, was the right machine in the hands of the right men, but it was far, far too late. Protecting the protectors, the Platzschutzstaffel, March-April 1945. The greatest vulnerability of the Me-262 remained its takeoff and landing phases. Allied fighter pilots had become experts at rat-catching over jet airfields, pouncing on the jets when they were slow, low on fuel, and unable to accelerate quickly. The problem became so acute that JV-44's combat effectiveness was being crippled. The aces, capable of taking on entire bomber formations, were being picked off one by one before they could even begin their missions or as they returned home. Galland's solution was both pragmatic and, from a technological perspective, deeply ironic. He created a special protective squadron, the Platzschutzstaffel, Airfield Protection Squadron, whose sole job was to fly defensive patrols over the airfield while the jets were taking off and landing. The aircraft chosen for this vital task was the Focke-Wulf FW-190D9, the long-nosed Dora. The Dora was arguably the pinnacle of German piston-engine fighter design, a powerful aircraft with excellent performance at low and medium altitudes, precisely the environment where the Me-262 was most vulnerable. The irony was palpable. The most advanced propeller fighters were now serving as bodyguards for the new jet fighters. The Platzschutzstaffel was painted with distinctive bright red undersides and white stripes to distinguish them from Allied aircraft and prevent friendly fire incidents. The unit was commanded by Lieutenant Heinz Sachsenberg and was composed of other skilled pilots. Their radio communications, logged in the JV-44 War Diary, are terse and professional, calling out Indians. The code word for enemy fighters, and vectoring to intercept incoming P-51s and P-47s. This specialized unit was a microcosm of the air war's evolution. It demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of combined arms tactics, using the strengths of one aircraft type to cover the weaknesses of another. It was a brilliant tactical solution, but its very necessity underscored how completely the Allies dominated the skies. The German Eagles now needed their own shepherds just to leave the nest. The Allied response, Doctrine and Dominance, 1944 to 1945. Allied intelligence had been aware of the German jet program since at least 1943. Declassified intelligence summaries from USAF and RAF commands show a growing alarm throughout 1944 as reports of encounters with the mystery jets increased. Initially, pilots' exaggerated claims of the Me-262's speed led to a period of near panic. However, the Allies responded not with a technological panic of their own jets, the British Gloucester Meteor and American P-80 Shooting Star, were not yet ready for widespread combat, but with methodical tactical doctrine. Top American aces like Don Blakesley and Hub Zemke, commanding the 4th and 56th Fighter Groups respectively, debriefed their pilots extensively after every encounter. A clear picture of the Me-262's weaknesses emerged. Its acceleration was poor. It couldn't outturn a P-51 Mustang or a Spitfire. It was a slug during takeoff and landing. Based on this analysis, a simple but highly effective set of rules was disseminated to every Allied fighter pilot. Rule 1. Never try to chase a Me-262 in a straight line or in a climb. It's a waste of fuel and you will lose. Rule 2. Engage it in a turning fight. If a jet pilot was foolish enough to get into a dogfight, a Mustang could turn inside it and bring its 6.50 caliber machine guns to bear. Rule 3. Attack it near its airfield. This became the primary tactic. USAF fighter groups were assigned specific German jet bases to patrol relentlessly. Pilots would wait patiently at 20,000 feet for the jets to appear. Rule 4. When attacking bomber formations, break and engage the escorts. P-51 pilots were instructed to fly well ahead of their big friends, the bombers, and aggressively engage the jets before they could even set up their attack runs. This combination of battlefield intelligence, superior numbers, and well-thought-out doctrine effectively neutralized the Me-262's technological supremacy. The jet was a superior aircraft, but it was fighting against a superior, fully integrated air combat system. The final variant, the two-seater night fighter, October 1944 to May 1945. While the daylight battles raged, another version of the Me-262 was being desperately rushed into service to counter a different, equally devastating threat, the nightly raids by RAF Bomber Command. The British had perfected night bombing into a science of terrifying efficiency, and the German propeller-driven night fighters like the Ju-88 and He-219 were struggling to catch the fast-improving Lancaster and Halifax bombers, especially the high-speed de Havilland Mosquitoes. The solution was the Me-262B1A/U1, a two-seat night fighter variant. This model was created by converting the standard Me-262B1A two-seat trainer. The rear seat was occupied by a radar operator, and a FUG 218 Neptune radar array was fitted in the nose, its distinctive Hirschgewei, stag's antlers, aerials adding drag and slightly reducing the jet's top speed. A small experimental unit, Commando Welter, commanded by Oberleutnant Kurt Welter, began flying these jets in late 1944. Their performance was astounding. The jet's speed allowed them to make multiple attack passes on a bomber stream in a single sortie, something a piston fighter could rarely manage. Welter and his pilots became the most successful night fighter crews of the war on a per-sortie basis. Welter himself claimed around 20 aircraft flying the jet at night, including several Mosquitoes, the nemesis of the night fighter force. His personal combat reports, stored in German archives, described the eerie experience of closing in on an unsuspecting Lancaster at a closing speed of over 300 km per hour, guided by the glowing green blips on the radar scope. The attack was swift and brutal, a short burst from the 108 Malawian Quachas cannons, and another bomber would fall from the sky. However, like every other aspect of the Me-262 story, it was too little, too late. Only a handful of these effective night fighters, perhaps no more than a dozen, were ever made fully operational. They were a technological marvel that scored impressive local successes but were statistically insignificant against the nightly onslaught of 1,000 bombers. The captured Swallow, Operation Lusty, May 1945 and beyond. As the Third Reich crumbled in May 1945, a new race began, the race to capture German technology. The Me-262 was at the top of every Allied intelligence agency's shopping list. The Americans launched Operation Lusty, Luftwaffe Secret Technology, a mission led by Colonel Harold E. Watson, a former test pilot. Watson assembled a team of pilots and technicians who scoured the captured airfields of Germany for intact, flyable examples of advanced German aircraft. They found Me-262s in various states of assembly and disrepair at Lechfeld, Rhein, and other bases. The team worked feverishly to make them airworthy, often cannibalizing several damaged jets to create one flyable machine. The German ground crews, now prisoners of war, were often co-opted to assist, their technical knowledge being indispensable. The captured jets were painted with prominent use-off markings to prevent them from being shot down by trigger-happy Allied pilots. In a series of daring flights, Watson's pilots flew the prized jets out of Germany to Cherbourg in France. From there, they were carefully crated and loaded aboard the British escort carrier HMS Reaper for the journey to the United States. Similar efforts were undertaken by the British and the Soviets, each eager to dissect the secrets of German jet technology. In the U.S., the captured Me-220 SIXS were exhaustively tested at Wright Field in Ohio and Freeman Field in Indiana. American test pilots, including Chuck Yeager, flew them and were stunned by their performance, even as they were horrified by the unreliability of the Jumo engines. The post-flight technical analyses are a testament to the jet's influence. The Me-262's swept-wing design, a feature added late in its development simply to adjust the center of gravity, was discovered to be the key to overcoming the sound barrier. This discovery, based directly on the captured German data, profoundly influenced the design of the next generation of American fighters, including the legendary F-86 Sabre, which would go on to duel Soviet MiGs, themselves heavily influenced by German jet technology, in the skies over Korea. The Swallow's shadow would stretch long into the Cold War. The Achilles heel, the Junkers Jumo 004 engine. To truly understand the Me-262, one must dissect its heart of fire and failure, the Junkers Jumo 004 engine. This power plant was simultaneously a work of genius and a metallurgical nightmare. An in-depth analysis of its design, based on post-war Allied technical intelligence reports, reveals the extreme compromises its designer, Anselm Franz, was forced to make. The ideal materials for a jet engine's hot section, the combustion chambers and turbine, are alloys rich in nickel, cobalt, and chromium, which are highly resistant to heat and stress. By 1943, these materials were practically unavailable in Germany, reserved for other critical industries. Franz was therefore compelled to design an engine using primarily common steel. This was an incredible engineering challenge. The turbine blades, which spun at nearly 9,000 revolutions per minute in a stream of gas at 800 degrees Celsius, were the critical failure point. Franz's team engineered them from chromator, a steel alloy containing 12% chromium, coated with a thin layer of aluminum to resist oxidation. Even more remarkably, to save material and weight, the blades were hollow and air-cooled, with compressed air from the engine itself being bled through their interior. This clever design made the engine possible, but it came at a terrible cost: reliability. The average lifespan of a Jumo 004B engine was a mere 10 to 25 hours. In the hands of an inexperienced pilot, it could be ruined in a single flight. A pilot had to nurse the throttles, avoiding any sudden movements. Advancing the throttle too quickly led to overfueling and a catastrophic temperature spike, causing the turbine blades to stretch, a phenomenon known as creep. If the pilot was lucky, the engine just flamed out. If unlucky, a blade would detach and rip through the engine casing like shrapnel. Post-war interrogations of captured Me-262 pilots are filled with harrowing tales of engine fires and failures. This inherent fragility defined the aircraft's operational limits. It forced pilots to fly with one eye on the enemy and the other on their temperature gauges, transforming the world's most advanced fighter into a delicate, temperamental beast that was often as dangerous to its operator as it was to the enemy. The human element, voices from the cockpit. Beyond the steel and schematics, the story of the Me-262 resides in the experiences of the men who flew it. Their memoirs and recorded debriefings provide a visceral understanding of what it was like to pilot this machine. Johannes Mackie Steinhoff, a 176 victory ace who flew with JV-44, described his first flight as a pact with the devil. He spoke of the eerie silence after engine start, replaced by a demonic, rising howl, and the astonishing acceleration on takeoff. But this exhilaration was always tempered by fear. On April 18, 1945, Steinhoff's own Me-262 suffered a tire blowout on takeoff. Unable to stop and with insufficient speed to lift off properly, the jet crashed, and Steinhoff was engulfed in a fireball. He survived, but with horrific burns that scarred him for life. His fate was a dramatic example of the jet's non-combat dangers. In contrast, Heinz Bahr, the top-scoring jet ace, was a master of the machine. A burly, working-class pilot, he had an intuitive feel for machinery and learned to handle the Jumo engines perfectly. His combat reports are models of calm, deadly efficiency. He treated the jet not as a thoroughbred, but as a tool, and he knew its limits. He rarely engaged in risky maneuvers, preferring the single, devastating high-speed pass. Then there were the novices, rushed into jets with minimal training. Their accounts are tragic. Many were terrified of the aircraft. One captured young pilot told his Allied interrogators he was more afraid of the takeoff than of the enemy fighters waiting for him. He recounted how, on his first solo flight, the instructor's only advice on handling the throttles was, pretend you are holding a raw egg in your hand, and you are stroking a virgin. This mixture of elite aces who mastered the machine and terrified rookies who were killed by it is central to the Me-262 story. It was a weapon that demanded a new level of skill and discipline that the dying Luftwaffe could no longer consistently provide. Economic and industrial context, a feudal masterpiece. Analyzing the Me-262 from an economic and industrial perspective reveals the ultimate futility of the project. By the time the jet entered mass production in late 1944, the German war economy was collapsing. The Allied strategic bombing campaign, while not halting production entirely, had forced it underground and into dispersed, inefficient forest factories. A detailed study of the Me-262's production records shows that approximately 1,430 units were built. However, this number is deeply misleading. It is estimated that due to fuel shortages, a lack of trained pilots, and constant attacks on airfields, no more than 200 Me-262s were ever operational at any one time. Often, the number was below 100. For every jet that made it into combat, several more were destroyed on the ground, lost in training accidents, or were simply sitting on an airfield, unable to fly due to a lack of JP-004 jet fuel, a synthetic kerosene that was even harder to produce than the aviation gasoline for piston engines. Each Me-262 represented a massive investment of skilled labor and rare materials. Could these resources have been better used? This is a key debate among historians. Some argue that producing several thousand more FW-190 Doris or Ta-152s, superb piston engine fighters that used existing infrastructure and could be flown by less trained pilots, would have been a more effective use of resources for air defense. Others maintain that the jet was the only weapon with the potential to inflict unsustainable losses on the bomber fleets. The ultimate verdict of the archives is stark. The Me-262 was a masterpiece of technology produced by a system that was no longer capable of supporting it. It was like building a finely crafted Swiss watch in the middle of an earthquake. The craftsmanship was undeniable, but the environment doomed it to irrelevance. The jet sat on the ground, gleaming and useless, while the Allied armies rolled across Germany. The strategic what-if, a sobering analysis. The most enduring question surrounding the Me-262 is the what-if. What if it had been deployed in mass numbers in early 1944, as a pure interceptor, just as Adolf Galland demanded? Could it have changed the course of the war? A rigorous, multifaceted analysis suggests that while it would have been devastating, it would not have been decisive. Let's assume, hypothetically, that 1,000 fully operational Me-262 interceptors were available by the spring of 1944. The effect on the U.S. 8th Air Force's daylight bombing campaign would have been catastrophic. Unescorted by jets of their own, the P-51s and P-47s would have suffered terrible losses, and they might have been unable to effectively protect the bombers. The B-17 and B-24 loss rates would have skyrocketed, potentially forcing a temporary halt to the daylight strategic bombing campaign. This would have been a major tactical victory for the Luftwaffe. However, it would not have altered the strategic reality of the war. The Allies had overwhelming numerical superiority. They would have adapted. They would have accelerated their own jet programs, the P-80 and Meteor. They would have shifted to night bombing with the RAF, against which the Me-262 had a very limited presence. Most importantly, the war would have been won on the ground. The D-Day landings would still have proceeded, supported by absolute naval dominance and tactical air power that would have savaged the jets on their airfields. The Red Army, with its millions of soldiers and tens of thousands of tanks, would have continued its inexorable advance on the Eastern Front, an arena where the Me-262 had virtually no impact. The jet could have prolonged the air war over Germany and made the price of victory for the Allies much, much higher in terms of airmen's lives. It could have delayed the end, but it could not have changed the outcome. The war was already lost due to factors far beyond the scope of a single weapon system: logistics, industrial capacity, manpower, and the strategic folly of fighting a two-front war. Legacy: the dawn of a new age. The final assessment of the Messerschmitt Me-262 is one of profound duality. As a weapon of the Second World War, it was a failure. It was a case of too little, too late. It was hobbled by political interference, hamstrung by engine troubles, and produced by an industry on the brink of annihilation. Its impact on the outcome of the war was statistically negligible. The roughly 1,430 jets built shot down an estimated 542 Allied aircraft, a number still debated, for the loss of over 1,000 of their own, the majority to non-combat causes. It was a candle flame against a hurricane. However, as a piece of technology, it was an overwhelming, revolutionary success. The Me-262 was the future. It was the moment aviation crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Every single fighter jet that flew in the latter half of the 20th century, from the F-86 Sabres and MiG-15s over Korea to the F-4 Phantoms over Vietnam and beyond, owes a piece of its design heritage to the sleek, swept-wing German machine. The captured German engineers and their technical data, distributed among the victorious powers, kick-started the jet age in the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. The lessons learned from the Me-262's failures, the need for reliable engines, tricycle landing gear, and robust airframes, were just as important as the lessons from its successes, like the swept wing and heavy cannon armament. The Swallow's shadow, therefore, extends far beyond the smoke-filled skies of 1945. It represents a pivotal moment in military and aviation history, a flawed harbinger of a new era of warfare defined by speed, altitude, and technological supremacy. It was born of a dying regime's desperation, but its legacy was the blueprint for the next 50 years of air power, forever changing the face of the sky. The files on the Me-262 can be closed, but the echoes of its shrieking turbines can still be heard in every jet that streaks across the heavens today.